Hi again. We've reached the end of The Rise of Adventism. Editor Edwin Gaustad. This section is the last chapter. Jonathan Butler is the author of it, Adventism and the American Experience. Butler has just been dealing with the fact that the Adventists had this uneasy peace after the Civil War, expecting that the America and the rest of the world would wind down and the kingdom would be coming imminently. Now they are in this period of an uneasy peace between the Civil War and whatever. And we know that that period is now extended to 160 years and we're still here. So they're talking about the fact that the gist of Ellen G. White's work in that generation seemed to be to establish the Sabbatarian theology of Seventh-day Adventism against the general theology of the American Republic, that is the Protestant Republic, which was generally post-millennial and optimistic rather than pessimistic, at least until World War I. And the calling card of the movement became Sabbatarianism versus Sunday legislation. And a lot of Adventists were persecuted for sticking to their guns in that period. Butler goes on, Sabbatarianism was overshadowed by another evangelical crusade to save the Republic, which fared better at the polls. That was prohibition. Seventh-day Adventists had been introduced to temperance by the teetotaling sea captain Joseph Bates, and following the lead of other northern evangelicals, they soon adopted a stringent temperance platform. After the health visions of Ellen White in the early 1860s, the Western Health Institute, later known as the Battle Creek Sanitarium, was founded, and the Health Reformer magazine was published. In 1876, John Harvey Kellogg, a surgeon, took over as superintendent of the Battle Creek Sanitarium and implemented the Adventist natural diet of abstinence from alcohol, tea, coffee, tobacco, and meat, or at least the unclean meats of Leviticus 11. It was his brother, W.K. Kellogg, business manager at the sanitarium, who appropriated John Harvey's ideas on healthful foods to build a breakfast cereal empire. In 1879, Adventists organized an Adventist Health and Temperance Association headed by John Harvey Kellogg that pledged itself against all stimulants. Seventh-day Adventists approved of the WCTU and the Anti-Saloon League, but felt a more radical temperance pledge was necessary. Further, Adventists were uneasy about supporting temperance organizations that backed Sunday legislation as well. It was in the 1880s that Seventh-day Adventist temperance broadened from an interest in individual hygiene to a concern of national proportions. In 1881, Ellen White inveighed against intemperance as a cause for the moral paralysis on society. Life and property were endangered, taxation increased, youth corrupted, families broken, prisons crowded, and gallows supplied by intemperance. The advocates of temperance fail to do their whole duty unless they exert their influence by precept and example, by voice and pen and vote in favor of prohibition and total abstinence. That was a direct quote from White. She added in an Arminian tone, "We need not expect that God will work a miracle to bring about this reform and thus remove the necessity for our exertion. We ourselves must grapple with this giant foe. Our motto, no compromise and no cessation of our efforts till the victory is gained." The rank-and-file Adventist was still squeamish about the political nature of prohibition and at times even balked at voting. It required some explanation in 1882 when an Adventist pastor, William C. Gage, was elected mayor of Battle Creek. G.I. Butler, the General Conference president, wrote that Gage's election did not break with the traditional Adventist policy, with certain exceptions, against political office holding. Gage's election was needed in the cause of temperance, which was of larger political consequence than most issues, as it involved the safety of our youth and the well-being of society. After the turn of the century, Seventh-day Adventists engaged in temperance rallies in the East and then the Midwest. These featured WCTU and YMCA representatives and prominent Protestant ministers as speakers. The rallies occurred after the close of Adventist camp meetings and were treated as basically political and not religious. Casey Russell, as head of the Religious Liberty Department, advised Adventists to make clear at the rallies that, quote, "we believe in appealing to the civil law for the prohibition of the liquor traffic, not because it is immoral or unchristian, but because it invades the natural rights of the citizen by being a menace to society," end of quote. Russell's logic was that Adventists should not demand prohibition on a religious basis any more than evangelicals should propose a religious Sunday law. Adventists should appeal for prohibition on strictly political grounds, though there was certainly a religious aspect to the issue, or they would compromise their own stand on Sunday legislation. Russell then cited a recent Ellen White statement on prohibition in keeping with her view of the last 25 years. Quote, "The honor of God, the stability of the nation, the well-being of the community, of the home, and of the individual demand that every possible effort be made in arousing the people to the evil of intemperance. Let the voice of the nation demand of its lawmakers that a stop be put to this infamous traffic," end of quote. As the prohibition forces gathered momentum, Seventh-day Adventists stepped up their own involvement. Petition forms were published in Liberty magazine. Casey Russell and others presented papers before the House District Committee. S.B. Horton reported approvingly of a prohibition march on Washington, D.C., sponsored by the National Temperance Convention that included members of Washington area churches. C.S. Longacre, editor of Liberty magazine, reviewed the election year successes of prohibition in 1918 and exclaimed, "Let democracy triumph everywhere, and in all things pertaining to civil relations, duties, and obligations," unquote. Other examples of this worldly Adventist concern in this period could be enumerated. Adventists responded to the crisis in the cities with an elaborate medical missionary program envisioned by Ellen White and administered largely by John Harvey Kellogg. City missions were established in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and elsewhere. These included dispensaries, restaurants, laundry facilities, the working men's home, and the halfway houses for unwed mothers or rehabilitated prostitutes. In accordance with their doctrine of the whole man, Seventh-day Adventists hoped to save not the soul only, but the soul, mind, and body. The Lifeboat magazine served as the organ of Adventist inner-city work, with a peak circulation of 200,000. Monthly issues of the magazine were dedicated to such topics as juvenile delinquency problems, the intolerable child labor situation, and prison conditions. Dr. David Paulson, editor of the Lifeboat, wrote that these social problems, quote, "will not be settled in prayer meetings or in conventions, but by individual effort on the part of men and women in whose hearts throb a genuine love of humanity," end of quote. While Adventists maintained their anti-urban animus and planned ultimately to flee the corruptive cities, they expended much energy on the cities around 1900. In addition to the urban north, the rural south captivated Adventist interest in the romantic venture of Edson White, son of the prophetess, who traveled down the Mississippi in the 70-foot steamboat Morning Star. Beginning in 1895, Adventists labored among blacks in the Vicksburg, Mississippi area by distributing clothing and food and introducing them to techniques in crop variation until the project was abbreviated by the gunshots of white Southerners. These reformist impulses in the Seventh-day Adventism of the 1880s and 1890s complicate the usual picture of the premillennialist. Two developments had occurred. First, while the classically premillennialist Millerites saw themselves at the outset as a voluntary association, ecumenical in nature, and then towards 1843 and 44 took on a narrow sectarian identity, Seventh-day Adventists gradually adopted a broader denominational identity, which, after a couple of decades, had assimilated what amounted to a variety of voluntary association activities. Second, while the Millerites and the post-Millerite Adventists adhered to an apocalypticism, the later Seventh-day Adventists settled into a more traditional, between-the-times eschatology. Seventh-day Adventists would not typically look for the Lord's appearing in 20 or 25 days, as had Miller, though there would remain an early Adventist conscience among them murmuring the still small voice of apocalypticism. With Seventh-day Adventists, both apocalypticism and more traditional eschatology could sustain itself in tandem, sometimes in the same person, with a concomitant effect on how they related to society. Seventh-day Adventists preached an imminent second coming, while at the same time engaging in long-range social and political programs. The Seventh-day Adventist shift from sect to denomination involved inevitable cultural and political accommodation. As New Englanders and Western New Yorkers, Adventists had shared from the beginning in a Yankee ethic that would make them virtually indistinguishable from other middle-class Americans. Very like the Mormons. While Jehovah's Witnesses, likewise indigenous to America, retained the disinherited status of the sect or cult, Seventh-day Adventists embraced social and economic upward mobility with religious zeal. The iconographic metamorphosis in Adventist literature from America as a beast to a buffalo to a lamb must be accounted for as much in these cultural terms as politically. Adventists, finding themselves comfortably at home in American culture, tended to fall victim to the irony of hoping for a delayed end while preaching an imminent end. There were now reasons to be reconciled to the delay. The politics of Seventh-day Adventist premillennialism moved from the apolitical withdrawal of Millerism to the radical republicanism of the 1850s and 60s, and then the more moderate republicanism of the 1880s and after. Both Millerites and early Adventists invested virtually nothing in the American Republic, for it appeared to them as a demon or dragon without earthly promise. During the Civil War, Adventists were in sympathy with the radical Republicans, but would not petition, hold office, engage in combat, and would seldom vote. The 1880s found them abandoning this politics of apocalypticism, as they voted, petitioned, and occasionally held office in the name of temperance, Seventh-day Sabbatarianism, and other issues. Unlike European millenarians, such as Anabaptists, Fifth Monarchists, or Andalusians, who built their millennium over against the existing state in either violent hostility or utter withdrawal, these American Adventists came to use the Republic, in a sense, to fulfill their millennial dream. Seventh-day Adventist political accommodation established a prophetic stance that left them only at the periphery of the political process and not entirely absorbed by it. Adventists continued to hold reservations about the Republic, as the Mormons did not, for example, for they expected the two-horned beast to fail ultimately. If America did not fail, the end would never come. So ends Jonathan Butler's last chapter, Adventism and the American Experience, and so ends our reading of The Rise of Adventism, which book I strongly advocate as an essential read for those coming from a Jehovah's Witness background. Put in a link to another series we recently completed, which is called J.W. Roots, The Minds That Made the Watchtower. It's based on Nelson Barber and Charles Taze Russell's book from 1877, Three Worlds. See you soon.